There is a moment every child experiences at least once standing in a crowd, scanning faces, searching for the one face that belongs only to them. Most of us find it. A hand rises, a voice calls out, and the world snaps back into place. But what happens to the child who searches and searches, and the face is never there? What happens to that searching when it does not stop at childhood, when it follows a person across decades, across oceans, all the way into old age? This story is about three people who carried that search inside them for most of their lives. If you have ever wondered whether the people who love you truly know how much they shaped you, stay with this. If you have ever felt the particular loneliness of a question no one around you can answer, this story was made for you. By the end, you will understand why a mother in Vietnam kept crying alone in the dark for 32 years while telling everyone around her she was perfectly fine, and you will understand exactly what she was waiting for the courage to say. Her name was Tram. That is the only name you need to hold on to for now, Tram. It is a soft name, a name that sounds like something fragile trying to stay whole. She was born in 1956 in Quyen, a province in northern Vietnam, where the mountains press close to the river and the fog in the mornings makes everything look a little uncertain, a little unfinished. She grew up in a large family with many brothers and sisters, which meant she learned early that love was something you had to share in small portions, that there was never quite enough of anything to go around, and that the best way to survive was to keep moving, keep working, keep your hands busy so your mind did not have time to wander into sadness. She was, from her earliest years, a woman who chose action over grief. It was not a choice born of coldness. It was a choice born of necessity, and there is a significant difference between those two things, even if the result can sometimes look the same from the outside. She married a man from Quyen, a province not far from hers, which in those years meant they were neighbors in the way that two people can be neighbors when geography is the only language of closeness you have. He was a good man. That much is clear from everything that comes after, because a woman does not grieve a man the way Tram grieved hers unless he was genuinely worth grieving. In 1981, she gave birth to their first son. She named him Quang, Nguyen Viet Quang. She chose the name carefully, the way you choose a name when you believe the child carrying it will have time to grow into it, to fill it out, to make it his own over the long, unhurried years of an ordinary life. She was pregnant with their second child when everything broke. She was in the kitchen. It was late afternoon, the particular kind of late afternoon in northern Vietnam, when the light goes golden and heavy and the whole world seems to slow down just before dusk. She was cooking rice when the news arrived. Her husband had been on a train heading from Lao Cai toward Tuan Quang. He had jumped from the moving train. No one fully explained why, and perhaps the reason does not matter now, and the fall had done what falls from moving trains do to a human body. He did not survive. He was gone, just like that. In the time it takes rice to cook, her entire life had rearranged itself into a shape she had not chosen and could not refuse. She did not fall apart. She wanted to, but she had a son who was not yet 2 years old, and a child growing inside her who had not yet decided what kind of person it would be. and there was no room in her circumstances for the collapse her heart was demanding. She buried her husband with the help of her family. She stood at the grave with her small son clutching her hand. And then she turned around and walked back toward a life that had become almost unbearably hard. The second boy was born a few months later. She named him Quyen. Nguyen von Quyen. 2 boys, 2 names, 2 small lives entirely dependent on a woman who was entirely dependent on the strength she was still teaching herself to have. For 10 years she worked. She farmed land that did not belong to her, hired out her labor to whoever needed it, carried things that were too heavy, rose before the sun, slept after it. She fed her boys. She kept them clothed. There was never enough, but there was enough. That distinction, the space between never enough and enough, was the entire geography of her existence for a decade. And then even that narrow margin was taken from her. The flood came in the way. Floods always come not gradually, not with warning enough to do anything useful, but suddenly and completely. The water rose until the house was gone, not damaged, not flooded gone. Everything the family owned was carried away in the current. The boys were safe. She held them above the water, and she kept them safe. But when the flood receded, there was nothing left to hold. They lived in other people's houses. They ate other people's food. Tram, who had spent a decade learning to provide, was now unable to provide anything at all. And that particular helplessness, the helplessness of a mother who cannot feed her own children, is one of the most corrosive feelings the human heart can be asked to contain. She watched her boys. Quang was around 10 years old by then. He was a child who noticed things, who paid attention. One afternoon he came to her and said quietly, "The way children say things they sense might cause pain. I want to go to school. I want to learn." She heard those words, and she felt something inside her move in a way she could not stop or redirect. She looked at her son's face, and she thought about what she was able to give him and what she was not. And the gap between those 2 things was so enormous that she could not cross it. She cried that night. She cried the next night too. And the night after that, she began to think about something she did not want to think about, but that kept returning because it was the only thought that pointed toward any kind of future for her sons. There was an organization in Hanoi. She had heard about it from people in her village. The kind of half-spoken information that travels through communities where everyone knows everyone, and the words travel faster than the feet that carry them. The organization helped Vietnamese children find adoptive families abroad. France, mostly. French families who wanted children, who could give them things that Tram could not: education, stability, enough food every day, a future that did not depend on the mercy of the weather or the labor market, of a province that had little to offer. She turned the idea over in her mind for weeks. She set it down. She picked it up again. She held it up to the light of what she knew about her boys, about their intelligence and their sweetness and their capacity for joy. And she asked herself the question that only a parent in genuine desperation can ask: would they be better without me? It is important to understand what kind of love asks that question. It is not a love that has given up. It is a love so enormous and so cornered that it turns itself inside out, offering its own loss as the last remaining gift. Tram did not want to send her sons away. Every cell in her body resisted it. But Quyen had said, "I want to go to school." And she had nothing to give him except the chance that someone else might. She made the journey to Hanoi with both boys. The city was large and loud and indifferent in the way cities are always indifferent to small private sorrows. She arrived at the organization with her sons, and she sat across from people she did not know, and she explained her situation, and they listened and nodded, and eventually she signed papers she did not fully understand in a language she was trying to trust. The boys, Quyen and Quyen, were told they were going on a journey. They did not know where. They were children. They were 10 and 12 or thereabouts. They were old enough to have personalities, and old enough to have attachment, and old enough, it turned out, to have enough grace that their final words to their mother were not ones of fear or blame. Quyen told her, "Don't worry, mother. Work carefully. When we come back, we will have money. We will be fine." She held them. She held them the way you hold something you know you are about to release when every muscle in your hands wants to refuse. And then she let them go. She walked out of that building and she got on the bus back to Quyen, and for the entire 100 kilometers of that journey, she did not speak to anyone. She sat in her seat and she looked out the window, and she felt the distance between herself and her sons, growing with every kilometer, becoming something physical and permanent, a wound that would not close because it was always being reopened by the simple ongoing fact of their absence. That night she did not sleep. She lay in the dark, and she told herself she had done the right thing. She told herself this with great conviction. The way you recite something you are not sure you believe, but desperately need to. And then she turned her face into the pillow so no one would hear, and she wept. She did not stop weeping. Not really. Not for 32 years. She left Quyen. There was nothing left there for her. The boys were gone. The house was gone. And staying felt like a form of punishment she did not need to actively choose. She went to Hajiang, the northern borderland province, with its karst mountains and its hard-working people and its reputation as a place where you could start over if you were willing to work hard enough. She was willing. She was always willing to work. It was the one thing she had never had to teach herself, the one resource that poverty and grief and flood and loss had never fully taken from her. She worked every kind of job available to a woman with strong hands and a desperate need to be occupied. She cleaned. She carried. She sold. She saved money carefully, the way people who grew up with nothing always save money attentively, protectively, aware at every moment of how quickly it can disappear. She bought small plots of land when she could. In the years when land in Vietnam's northern provinces was something ordinary people could afford if they were disciplined and patient. The land increased in value. She bought more. She became, over time, something she could not have imagined in that flooded village with her 2 small boys and her empty hands. A woman of property, a woman of means, a woman who, by the material measurements of the world, had succeeded. None of it touched the grief. The grief lived in a room she never renovated. Every evening, when the work was done and the house was quiet, she went back to that room. She thought about Quyen. She thought about Quyen. She wondered what they looked like now, whether they were healthy, whether they had learned French, whether they ever thought about a village in Quyen and a mother who had let them go not because she did not love them, but because she loved them too much to keep them hungry. She cried into her pillow. 32 years of pillows quietly absorbing what she could not say out loud to anyone. Men approached her over the years. She was not unattractive, and she had become successful. And both of those things make a woman visible in ways she may not always choose. She declined them all, not with hostility, but with a finality that was hard to argue with. She could not explain to herself, and certainly not to anyone else, how she could open her heart to someone new when it was still entirely occupied by the 2 children she had given away on an ordinary afternoon in Hanoi. Love, for Tram, had become a fixed thing. It had a shape, and that shape was the shape of 2 small boys. One who wanted to go to school, one who had not yet learned to want anything yet because he was too young, and she had no interest in trying to fit anyone else into that shape. In 2002, she began, slowly and tentatively, to think about finding them. It had been almost a decade since they left. They would be young men now, 20 or 21, old enough to have their own lives and opinions, and perhaps their own reasons for not reaching back. She did not know where to begin. She called the organization in Hanoi, the one that had arranged everything. The phone rang. No one answered. She called again and again. The numbers were disconnected, or they rang endlessly, or when someone did pick up, they told her they had no information and she should try somewhere else. She tried somewhere else. Somewhere else had no information either. Someone in her community told her about people who specialized in finding overseas adoptees, who had connections in France and could track down families through documents and records. She paid them. She paid them a significant amount of money, money that represented real sacrifice even for a woman of her means, because the thing she was buying was not a service but a hope, and you will pay almost anything for a hope when you have been without one long enough. The money went. The people who took it went with it. The information did not come. She was defrauded once. She was defrauded again. Each time she allowed herself to be defrauded, it was because she could not quite bring herself to believe that someone would take money from a mother who only wanted to know if her children were alive. Around 2019 or so, she found, through someone she trusted, a way to reach people who helped families search for lost relatives. People who used social media and community networks and the kind of patient digital persistence that the older generation had not grown up with but had learned to rely on. She made contact. She explained her story. She was 63 years old, and she was sitting in a comfortable house that she owned, and she was surrounded by evidence of a successful life. And she was, underneath all of that, still the same woman who had cried herself to sleep for 3 decades because she had left 2 boys in a building in Hanoi and never properly said goodbye. She had a photograph. Somewhere around 1994 or 1995, the French family that had taken her sons had sent a photograph back to the village authority in Nkong. No one had told Tram about it at the time. Perhaps they did not know how to reach her. Perhaps they forgot. Perhaps the bureaucratic channels through which such things moved were too slow or too unreliable. but someone had kept it. And when she eventually went back to Quyen and asked the right people the right questions, they found it for her. A small photograph, color faded the way color in old photographs always fades, slightly blurry around the edges. Two boys, older now than when she last saw them, standing somewhere in France in what looked like good clothing, in what looked like a comfortable life. She had stared at that photograph for so long that she had memorized every detail of it, every angle of their faces, every fold of the clothing they were wearing. She carried it with her. She had carried it with her for years. This was the only thread she had. One photograph, one decade-old contact point, one name France, and 32 years of silence. She was nearly 70 years old. She owned property. She owned houses. She had told the people helping her that if her sons were found and if they were willing to come home, she would give each of them a house. All of it. Everything she had built over those 3 decades of solitary labor, she would give to them. Not because she felt she could purchase their forgiveness or their presence, but because the money had never meant what the boys meant, and she had simply been keeping it safe until they came back to claim it. That is the kind of love that waits. The kind that does not need to be spoken to remain whole. The kind that survives 32 years of silence and fraud and unanswered phone calls and lost documents, and a system that moved 2 small children across the world and then closed the door behind them so completely that not even their mother could find the handle on her side. Somewhere in France, 2 men in their late 30s or early 40s were living lives she knew nothing about. They might have families of their own. They might have children. They might speak French more naturally than Vietnamese, might have lost the language their mother spoke entirely, might have lost everything except perhaps a faint memory of a woman's face, or the sound of a name spoken in a northern Vietnamese dialect on an ordinary afternoon in a city that was too big and too loud and too indifferent to notice what was happening in one small room. And then, in 2019, the thread began to move. Someone who knew someone shared Tram's story through a network of people who work in the quiet, patient business of reconnecting families broken by history and poverty, and the particular cruelty of circumstances that force good people into impossible choices. The story traveled the way stories travel now, quickly and unpredictably, through screens and platforms and shared connections that would have been unimaginable to the woman standing in that flooded village with nothing left. A name surfaced. A contact in France. Someone who might know something about 2 Vietnamese boys adopted by a French family in the early 1990s. And in a city in France, on an ordinary evening, a man named Quyen, who had been Nguyen Viet Quang, who had been 10 years old in a building in Hanoi, who had told his mother not to worry, picked up a phone and read a message from a stranger who claimed to know something about where he came from, and the message contained a detail that no stranger should have known, a detail so specific and so private that it stopped him completely in the middle of whatever he had been doing. The detail was his mother's name. Quang did not respond immediately. That is the first thing worth understanding about him. He was not a man who acted quickly on emotional information. He had learned, over the decades of building a life in France, that caution was a form of self-protection that had served him well. He had learned this the way people learn most of their most important lessons, by discovering what happens when you don't apply it. So he read the message once. He put the phone down. He picked it up and read it again. He set it on the table in front of him, and he sat with it for a long time, the way you sit with something that has the potential to either complete you or break you open, and you are not yet sure which one it will do. The message had come through a community network, the kind that exists quietly in the margins of social media, where Vietnamese diaspora communities pass information and stories and searches like a long, slow relay race that sometimes spans continents and decades. Someone had seen Tram's story. Someone had shared it. Someone else had recognized something in the details, the province, the years, the names, and had passed it further along the chain until it reached a person who knew. A person who knew how to find a man named Quyen living in France, who had been born in northern Vietnam and who had arrived in this country as a child with a younger brother named Quyen. His brother. That was the second thing that moved through him when he read the message. Not just a mother reaching across 32 years of silence, but the confirmation that someone out there was looking for both of them. He and Quyen had stayed in contact. They had grown up in the same French household, had gone through the particular confusion of childhood together in a country whose language they had to learn from scratch, had held on to each other through the years the way siblings do when they are each other's only connection to a shared past. They were close. They had always been close. But there was a layer of their shared history that neither of them could fully access, a room neither of them had the key to, and that room was everything that came before the plane, before France, before the new names and the new language and the new life. That room was a woman named Tram in a village in Quyen who had put them on a bus to Hanoi and stood at a window watching them go. He called Quyen. They talked for a long time, the two of them, circling the heat in the message the ways you circle something dangerous or sacred or both. They had not spent their lives in active search of their biological mother. This is important to say clearly, without judgment, because it is the truth, and the truth here is complicated. They had built lives. Good lives, by most measures. They had learned French, had been educated, had become adults who functioned well in the world they had been placed in. The grief of being separated from a biological mother is a real grief, but it lives alongside the real life that grows up around it. And for many people who were adopted as older children, the question of origin becomes something you carry carefully rather than something you actively pursue, because pursuing it means opening a door that you cannot predict the room behind. But Quyen had kept something. He had kept, somewhere in his memory, a small cluster of impressions from before, not clear memories, not narratives he could tell, but sensory fragments. The smell of a kitchen, the sound of a particular dialect, a woman's hands, large and rough and warm, the kind of hands that belong to someone who has worked hard for a long time. He could not have said, if asked, whether these impressions were real memories or constructions built from the knowledge that they must have existed. But they were there. They had always been there. And when he read the message containing his mother's name, something in his chest moved toward those fragments, the way a plant moves toward light, not dramatically, not all at once, but with the slow, certain persistence of something that has been waiting for permission. He and Quyen decided together that they would respond. They would be careful. They would not assume. They were, both of them, past the age of being swept away by hope. Alone they had reached the decade of their lives when you have experienced enough disappointment to know that good news needs to be verified before you allow yourself to feel it fully. But they would respond. They would provide what information they could, and they would wait. The people managing Tram's search were thorough. They understood that verification was not just procedurally important, but emotionally essential, that a reunion built on a misidentification, however well-intentioned, would cause a different and possibly worse kind of pain than no reunion at all. They gathered details. They cross-referenced dates. The year the boys had left. The organization in Hanoi. The province. The village name. And Kong. The names of the boys as recorded in the original paperwork, which had been partially altered, the ages adjusted downward to make the adoption process smoother, a bureaucratic manipulation that was apparently not uncommon in that era, and that had quietly complicated the lives of the people it was meant to help. Everything matched. Not approximately. Not close enough to be hopeful. Everything matched. The way pieces of a broken thing match when you finally fit them back together correctly, and you can see the line where the break happened. Tram was in her house in Ha Giang when the call came. She had been expecting it and not expecting it, the way you expect something you have been preparing for so long that the actual arrival of it still manages to surprise you. The person on the other end of the call told her what they had found, that there were 2 men in France who matched every detail, that they had been contacted, that they had confirmed the information, that they were willing to speak with her. She sat down. She did not cry immediately, which surprised her. She had spent 32 years crying alone in the dark, and now that the moment was here, she found herself very still, very quiet, the way a storm sometimes pauses before it truly begins. They arranged a video call. The technology that would allow a woman in Ha Giang province in northern Vietnam to see the faces of her adult sons in France in real time was not something that would have seemed possible to the woman who had stood in a flooded village with nothing in 1991. But here it was. Here the world was, having quietly accumulated the capacity to do this one extraordinary thing. She sat in front of the screen. She had dressed carefully. She was 63 or 64 years old, her hair gone gray at the temples, her face carrying the particular weathered quality of a person who has spent decades outdoors and in hard work. She looked like who she was, a woman who had survived an enormous amount and who had arrived at this moment with everything she had left to give held carefully in both hands. The call connected. 2 faces appeared on the screen. 2 Vietnamese men in their late 30s. One of them, the older one, had a quality about his eyes, something watchful, something careful that she recognized without being able to say precisely what she was recognizing. The younger one had a different kind of face, rounder and more open, and she searched it for something she could anchor to, some feature that would confirm what the documents and dates and village names had already told her, but that her body was still waiting to be told in its own language. No one spoke for a long moment. The silence stretched between three continents: Vietnam, France, and the 32 years in between. And it was the kind of silence that does not need to be filled because it is already full. Then Quyen said something. He said it in French, and the person facilitating the call translated it quietly. I remember a woman's hands. I don't know if that's a real memory, but I remember them. Tram pressed her own hands flat against the table in front of her. She looked at them, the hands that had farmed and carried and built and grieved, the hands that had held two small boys in a building in Hanoi and then released them into the wide, unpredictable mercy of the world. She said, in Vietnamese, her voice very steady, "They are the same hands. I have been keeping them for you." In the days that followed the call, something began happening that none of them had anticipated. The conversation did not end with the call. It continued. Quyen and Quyen began writing to her careful, thoughtful messages, short at first, then longer, feeling out the shape of a relationship that had the history of a family and the uncertainty of strangers meeting for the first time. They asked about Quyen Quang. They asked what the village had looked like. They asked about their father, whom they had no memory of at all, who was only a fact to them, a man who had loved their mother and had died on a train before the younger one was even born. Tram answered everything. She answered with the detail and the care of someone who has been storing information for decades, keeping it ready, knowing that someday someone would ask. She told them about the flood. She told them about the night she lay awake trying to decide. She told them, carefully and without excuses, what she had been thinking in the weeks before she brought them to Hanoi, that she had looked at her sons and seen children who deserved more than she had, and that giving them more had meant giving them away, and that she had not known how to live with that choice, and had simply kept living with it anyway because there was no alternative. Quyen listened. He was quiet for a long time after she explained. And then he said the thing she had not been sure she would ever hear, the thing she had been bracing herself against hoping for, because hope in that direction felt too large and too fragile to hold. I understand. I don't have enough information to judge, and I'm not sure I would want to if I did. You did what you could with what you had. I know that about you without knowing anything else. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something more honest than forgiveness and acknowledgement that the situation had been beyond the control of everyone in it, that a young widowed mother in a flooded province in northern Vietnam in 1991 had not been the author of the forces that made her choice feel necessary, and that the man she had become would not hold her responsible for circumstances that had been imposed on her rather than chosen. Quyen, the younger one, was quieter throughout these exchanges. He had always processed things more slowly. Quyen explained he was the one who sat with things, turned them over, needed time before he was ready to say what he felt. He participated in the calls. He listened. He responded when directly addressed. But he was not yet ready to speak in the full voice of what he was feeling. And Tram, who had spent 32 years sitting with things she could not say, understood this completely and did not push. Plans began to take shape. Careful plans, built with the same caution that had characterized all of it from the beginning. The possibility of an in-person meeting, a visit not yet certain, not yet scheduled, but genuinely possible in a way that it had never been before. Tram mentioned quietly what she had told the people who helped her search, that she had 2 houses, that she had built things with the intention of having something to pass on, that if her sons came home, even once, even briefly, she wanted them to know that everything she had was theirs, not as a transaction, not as payment for something she understood could not be paid for, but as evidence of a love that had not known where to put itself for 3 decades and had finally found, in concrete and bricks and land deeds, the only form of expression available to it. Quyen told her she didn't need to do that. She told him she knew. She told him she wanted to anyway. There was one thing left that sat unresolved between them, one fact that had not been fully named in all the conversations, one thing that Tram had not yet been able to say directly in a way that satisfied her. It was not information. All the information had been exchanged, verified, confirmed. It was something else. It was an apology, a real one, not the kind that defends itself or explains itself into something smaller than it actually is, but the kind that simply stands in front of what it has done and waits. She had been building toward it in every call. She had felt it sitting at the back of every message she sent. And on a call one evening, a call that happened to fall on an ordinary weeknight, with nothing particularly significant about the date or the weather or anything else, she finally said it. She said, "I want to tell you that I am sorry. I was your mother, and I was not there for you, and I am sorry. I know that is not enough. I am saying it anyway because you deserve to hear it from me and not from anyone else." The screen showed Quyen's face. He was sitting somewhere in his apartment in France, and the light behind him was low, and he looked like a man who had been waiting for something he had not let himself admit he was waiting for. He nodded. He said, "I hear you, Mother." It was the first time either of them had used that word. And it should have been the end of something, the resolution, the release, the moment when everything that had been held in tension finally came loose. But it was not the end. Because in that same conversation, just as the word mother was still settling into the space between them, quiet, careful, slow processing Quyen finally spoke in his own full voice for the first time, and what he said rearranged everything that all of them thought they understood about what had happened 32 years ago. Quyen said, "I remembered you. I always remembered you." He said it simply, without drama, the way people say things they have been carrying so long that the weight has become ordinary. He said he had been 6 or 7 years old when they left. The paperwork said younger, but children know their own age even when documents disagree, and that he had a memory, a real memory, not a fragment but a complete scene. A woman standing at a door, not watching him go, not waving, just standing, her arms at her sides, her face completely still, and him, a small boy on a bus pulling away from a building in Hanoi, watching that stillness through the window and understanding, in the wordless way that children understand enormous things, that she was holding herself that still, because if she moved even slightly, she would come apart entirely. He had carried that image for 32 years, not with bitterness, not with accusation, just with the quiet fidelity of someone who does not want to lose the last clear thing they have of a person they love. Tram did not speak for a long time after he said this. The facilitator on the call waited. Quyen waited. Everyone on both sides of the screen waited in the particular silence that falls when something true has been said in a room and the room needs a moment to absorb it. Then Tram said, "I moved. I did move. After the bus turned the corner. I sat down on the floor right there in the hallway, and I stayed there for a very long time." Quyen looked at her. He nodded once, slowly. That was all. No more explanation was needed. No more words were required to close the distance between what a mother had done and what a son had seen, between the stillness on the outside and the collapse on the inside, between the woman who had to appear strong enough to let them go and the woman who had crumbled the moment they could no longer see her. 32 years of silence, and the truth of it turned out to be this simple. She had not been unaffected. She had been devastated. She had simply waited until they could not see it to allow herself to fall. Quyen exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhale. It was the exhale of a man who has been holding his breath for a very long time and has finally been given permission to breathe normally. The calls continued through the following weeks. They found a rhythm, the three of them, a rhythm that accommodated the language barrier, the time difference, the decades of separate lives that had given them different reference points and different vocabularies for the same shared experience. Tram learned small things about her sons. Quyen drank his coffee black and was a careful, methodical person who planned everything in advance. Quyen cooked, apparently had become, in the French household and then in his own apartment, someone who found comfort in the preparation of food, who spent his weekends in the kitchen making things that required patience and attention. Tram listened to this and thought privately about the kitchen in Quyen, where she had been standing when the news of her husband came, and she wondered if Quyen's relationship with cooking was a coincidence or a thread connecting him to something he had no conscious access to. She did not say this out loud. Some things you hold gently rather than examine too closely, because the examination might undo the comfort they provide. She sent them photographs, old ones, from before the village, the house before the flood, the small garden she had kept with vegetables, and one photograph, the oldest one, damaged at the corner and faded almost beyond usefulness, of herself at 25, the year before Quyen was born, standing in front of a tree she could no longer identify in a place she could no longer quite place. She looked young in it, startlingly young. She looked like someone for whom everything was still possible and nothing had yet been taken. Quyen wrote back and said, "You look like someone I would have liked to know." She read that message 3 times. She did not reply to it immediately. She set her phone down and she went to the window and she looked out at whatever was outside the window that day, mountains, probably, or the edge of a town, or the specific quality of northern Vietnamese afternoon light that she had lived inside for most of her life. And she stood there for a while, just breathing, feeling something she had not felt in so long that it took her a moment to identify it. It was lightness. The particular lightness that comes when something you have been carrying is finally shared. The plans for a meeting became more concrete. A date was being considered, not rushed, not forced, but genuinely considered. with the kind of care that people apply when they understand that a thing can be done wrong even when done with the best intentions. Quyen had spoken with his employer about taking leave. Quyen had begun looking at flights. Tram had done something she had not told them about yet, something she had done quietly and alone one afternoon. She had gone to one of the houses, one of the two she had set aside for her sons, and she had walked through the empty rooms, and she had stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking at it, thinking about what it would look like when someone was actually living in it. When it had cups in the cupboard and shoes by the door and food on the stove. When it was a home instead of a held breath. She had opened the window in the kitchen just to let the air in, just to let the room start getting used to the idea of being inhabited. In the province of Quyen, some of Tram's relatives had heard the news. The story had traveled the way stories do in close communities quickly, with embellishment, carried by people who had known Tram for years and who found in her story the particular satisfaction that comes from witnessing a long-sustained hope finally resolve. Her sister called her. An old neighbor called. People she had not spoken to in years reached out, not to intrude, but simply to say, "We are glad. We remember when you left. We always wondered. We are glad." Tram accepted these calls graciously, but the ones that mattered, the only ones that had ever mattered, were the ones from France. From Quyen. In the late afternoon his time, early evening hers, when the light on both ends of the call was going golden. From Quyen, who was less frequent but more deliberate, who wrote long, careful messages that arrived in her inbox in the mornings, and that she read slowly with her tea, reading them twice to make sure she had not missed anything, the way you read something precious. One morning a package arrived. It had been sent from France, and it took a moment for Tram to understand what she was looking at when she unwrapped it. Inside was a small framed photograph, clearly recent, taken in good light in what looked like someone's kitchen. Two men standing together, one slightly taller, both looking directly at the camera with expressions that were not quite smiling but were not quite not smiling either. The expression that sits between the two, the one that means, "Here we are. This is real. We are letting you see us." She turned the frame over. On the back, in handwriting she did not recognize, but would spend the rest of her life learning to recognize, were 4 words in Vietnamese. 4 words, carefully written. The letters slightly uncertain in the way that letters are uncertain when a language is being reclaimed after long absence. The words were, "We are coming home." She set the frame on the table in front of her. She looked at the two faces. She looked at the handwriting on the back. She set it down face up, and she put both hands flat on either side of it, and she leaned over it slightly, the way you lean over something small and breakable that you want to protect. Somewhere in the house, a clock was marking the hour. Outside, whatever was happening outside was happening, traffic or birds, or the neighbor's radio, or the sound of northern Vietnamese wind coming down from the mountains. The ordinary machinery of an ordinary day, continuing exactly as it always had, indifferent to the fact that inside this one house a woman was standing over a photograph of her sons and allowing herself, for the first time in 32 years, to stop bracing for the loss that had already happened and simply feel the fact of what was arriving instead. She did not call anyone. Not immediately. She stood there for a while longer, just the three of them herself, and the photograph, and the 4 handwritten words on the back. She stood there until the light in the room shifted, until the clock finished whatever it was doing, until she had absorbed enough of the moment to be sure she would be able to find it again later when she needed it. Then she went to the kitchen. She opened the cabinet. She took out 2 cups, not one, not her usual single cup, but 2, and she set them on the counter side by side, and she filled the kettle, and she waited for it to boil. She did not make tea for the cups. The cups were not for now. They were for later, for when the door opened and there were people to fill them. But she set them out anyway, because some preparations are not practical. Some preparations are a way of telling the future that you are ready for it, that the space has been cleared, that you have been waiting, and you have learned to wait well, and you are not going anywhere. The kettle began to hiss softly on the stove. She stood at the window and looked out at the mountains, and she thought about a boy on a bus who had watched her stand still at a door 32 years ago. And she thought about how the truth of that moment, the truth she had been unable to show him then, the truth he had needed so long to hear, was not that she had been unaffected, was not that she had let go easily or without pain, was not that he had been less than everything to her. The truth was that she had sat down on the floor of that hallway the moment the bus turned the corner, and she had stayed there for a very long time. And then she had stood up, because there was nothing else to do, and she had walked back out into the world, and she had kept moving for 32 years in the direction of this one moment. This kitchen, these 2 cups, this kettle beginning to hiss, this particular quality of afternoon light coming through the window of a house she had quietly prepared for people. She had never stopped loving, even when loving them meant not knowing where they were, or whether they were warm, or whether they ever thought about a village in the north where the fog came in heavy off the mountains in the mornings. And a woman's hands had once been the whole world to them. Outside, a bird landed on the window ledge and then left again. The kettle came to a full boil. She did not turn it off immediately. She let it go for a moment, filling the kitchen with steam, filling the room with the particular warmth of water that has been heated past its limit and is releasing everything it has been holding. Then she turned it off, and the kitchen was quiet, and the 2 cups sat on the counter, empty and ready, pointing toward a morning that had not yet arrived, but that was, finally, genuinely, on its way. Is there someone who once let you go for reasons you did not understand until much later, and have you ever